Hello everyone, and welcome to this wonderful book launch of an amazing book, which I must say I absolutely love. I'm Pippa from Five Leaves, and I'm really pleased that we're launching this for Frances, because I think she's been a customer ever since we opened, and I think she would probably have been a customer before we opened if that was possible.
Lasting customer.
Talking about time, I think that's quite appropriate for the title of the book. Anyway, so a couple of housekeeping bits. Feel free to use the chat if you want to talk to each other. Tell us who you are and where you're from. That's always nice to know. Comment on what's being said. If there will be a chance to ask questions at the end in a Q&A session. If you want to propose some questions for Felicity to put to Frances, if you could put them in the Q&A box rather than the chat, then we can pick them up a lot more easily. And I think that's about all I've got to say. So I'm going to hand over to Felicity Whittle, who will be hosting the event. She's a tourist guide, not a tour guide. This is very important, I've just learned, who among many other things, leads literary walks around Nottingham, so she's very well versed in the literature of the area. So I'll hand over to you now, Felicity, and well done on your book, Frances. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pippa, and welcome everybody to our book launch of Frances Thimann's book, The Clock Museum and Other Stories. Frances, you and I, well, we've known each other for a few years, but you and I met, didn't we, when you emailed me to ask about the windmills along Forest Road. You'd seen a plaque, is that right?
It's a carving on a door just at the top of Mansfield Road on the corner of Forest Road. And I know there were a lot of windmills along the top of Forest Road at one stage. And I wondered if this was some sort of really historic door. It's a carving of a windmill about 2 foot high on a door. And one day I'm going to knock on that door and the little man covered with flour will emerge, blinking, I think. And maybe there'll be a story there as well. You were one of the few people who responded to my emails asking about what it was.
Well, we started an email correspondence and then we met for coffee, didn't we, and discovered that we'd both been librarians in our former lives, and so that obviously set the seal on a friendship. So this is The Clock Museum and Other Stories, is your fourth collection of stories to be published. Would you say that there is an overall theme to this? Not all collections do have a theme, but is there a sort of overall, what's the collection about? Maybe that's...
Yes, there is an overall subject, although it's quite a loose one. They were written at different times and about different characters, but they're all in some way about words themselves, about words and meanings, signs and symbols. They're about books and poems and the characters in them, the significance they can have for us, and the ways in which they can weave in and out of our lives, sometimes in strange and unpredictable ways. And sometimes this can work the other way around too, also strangely and unpredictably. So the first story in the book is called Indus Seal. And this is about a chap who's trying to cope with his son's terrible and hopeless war damage, PTSD, after his military service in Afghanistan. His daughter is studying history and is very studious, recommends that he should fix up an evening class or something to take his mind off things. And eventually he picks up one of the books which is in her room, and it's A History of the World in 100 Objects, which some of you may remember, about objects in the British Museum. He's not an educated man at all, but he picks up this one chapter, Indus Seals, because it's about the area near where his son was fighting. And he's intrigued by the pictures and the strange, indecipherable signs that they contain. I'm just going to hold up a picture here. A bit amateurish, I'm afraid. If you can see it in the book. I don't know if you can see it.
Mm. Yes, that's fine. Yes.
Right. There's another one. I should have done it properly, but it's only this one, really. It's another one. So very strange, and actually nobody yet can decipher the signs. The seal, by the way, it's not an aquatic, strange, blubbery creature. They were seals used for documents and trading and so on. And he reads up about this ancient Indus Valley civilization, which appears to have been peaceful, and that's important to him, as well as prosperous and egalitarian. And as he says, they did all right without the fighting. And this chance chapter gradually opens him up to further, deeper interest in history itself and why things happen and how they might happen differently. And he sees a connection between what's happened with his son and with all the other people affected by the fighting, the other lads who didn't make it, the mums and dads and sweethearts, and these old pictures and signs, and what he understands about them. So he decides to go up to London, visit the British Museum, to study the history of the world, to understand conflict and peace and everything else. And as he says at the end, to sort out what it all means.
Mm.
We hope he will.
So you yourself went to the British Museum, did you?
Yes, I went up to sort out what it all means. And I thought there might be some sort of McGregor trail, you know, 100 objects trail. And I asked at the front desk and nobody had a clue. And what I was talking about. And eventually I was directed to ancient Asian civilizations or something. And I found one little shelf on one little obscure wall with a few of these seals and a few little bits of pottery and a couple of little signs. Nobody was looking at it at all. And that was what McGregor picked out. Quite rightly, but nobody seemed to be following it up. I think the British Museum missed a trick. I think they should have started an international competition for writers to take one object and write about it, but they didn't anyway, but I did.
So you said signs, and that's obviously what Indus Seal is about, but you also said books and characters too?
Yes. Well, the next story, it is actually the next one in the collection, I think, Mrs. Rosenfarb, and it's completely different. She's a very isolated, elderly Jewish lady. She's living in a care home. The story alternates between the tiny events of her life, mostly just breakfast and tea and pills and visits from her carers, and the scenes that she remembers of her earlier life. Happy Jewish childhood in Eastern Europe, with the rituals and the prayers and the cherished holy books on the shelves. Her later life as a married woman in Vienna. Her family's flight to England in the 30s. And then her last place here in this home where she's alone because her son married an American woman and emigrated there. And by then she was much too frail to go with them. The only thing she's got left now of all this past and all this journeying is a prayer book. And it's the prayer book that she had as a child. And on this evening, she thinks of her childhood, the family home, the important holy books on the shelf, the murmur of the fire with her mother sewing at the table under the lamplight, the sound of her textiles and the sharp break of cotton thread. And I'd just like to read the last few paragraphs of that one. It is very quiet at this time, after the evening drink, after all the doors are closed, though sometimes there is a late family visitor, distant voices and footsteps. Mrs. Rosenfarb listens to the rooms and corridors about her. She listens for the voices and footsteps of her own family, as she has done for years, for her mother and for her brothers. She doesn't know what became of them. She listens for her son, her grandchildren, though she knows they have forgotten her. She sits almost motionless in her chair by the window. Her threadbare handkerchief twists in her palms. The embroidery is faded away. There's no light in the room, but she can still make out with her fingers the letters of her name. The prayer book is on her knee. She remembers all its passages now. She hears the words in her head and understands their meanings. She lifts the book and holds it to her heart. Outside, the empty plains stretch away to Russia, and leaves stir on the wind. But it is warm in the room, and there is the murmur of a fire. She listens for the soft slip of textile, the snap, cotton.
That's lovely. Yeah. And then characters was the other element that you
Yeah,
mentioned.
I just say that Mrs. Rosenfarb, this is relevant to what comes later, is very loosely based on my own great aunt by marriage, whom I never knew. And she's as remote from me as Catherine the Great. And yet the odd thing is that I'm a great aunt to 4 children, and I'm just part of the furniture. It's that strange sort of elasticity that families have. But I hope they won't write a story about me. Yeah. Characters. This is the Silver Rose, and it's one of the characters in the famous opera, The Knight of the Rose, Der Rosenkavalier, by Richard Strauss. The Marschallin. She always seems to become the main figure, the star of the opera, by virtue of her words, wisdom, and resignation, as she gives up her youthful lover to a much younger woman, and even more because of her music. In this story, she's become a real figure. She steps out of the opera, and I've followed her later life and thoughts about what she did then, what happened to her, and to the other characters when they stopped being in the opera and imprisoned in the plot. And it strikes me that this sort of thing, taking a well-known fictional character and placing it into a new story, has happened so many times. I think one of the earliest was Mrs. Rochester in the wide Sargasso Sea. And then there have been numerous Shakespeare characters, hundreds of them, and I'm thinking of just one, Naughts and Crosses by Mallory Blackman about Romeo and Juliet. Sometimes they're modernized, like Julius Caesar being transplanted to a modern business environment, or set in other countries. And I recently thought of Terry Pratchett's Weird Sisters, which I think are based on Macbeth. And of course, Shakespeare's become a character himself now in Hamlet. And then you have the prequels and the sequels, notably around Jane Austen. Sherlock Holmes has had many other characters, many other stories written about him. So, seems to be no end to it. And Dickens's characters have also become a part of our lives, thinking of Miss Havisham and Mr. Micawber particularly. And there's a wonderful novel called Mr. Pip, in which Great Expectations becomes vital to a young girl in her very disturbed and troubled life on Bougainville in Papua New Guinea, very impoverished and violent. It was the only book they had in their poverty-stricken school, and they all learnt it by heart. And later, the characters all become her companions through her difficult life. So there are loads and loads of them. Yes. I expect everyone can think of other ones as well.
Yeah. So you've touched on the fact that Mrs. Rosenfarb is connected to your family in some way, but how much of your own life story is in these stories?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and because I think the other way around, it happens to our own lives get back into the fiction, and with some difficulties sometimes. A writing colleague recently quoted P.D. James. Thank you, Andy, if you're there. All fiction is autobiographical, and most autobiography is fiction. Mm-hmm. And there is a term autofiction, I think, as well. Often writers do write entirely properly about something they want to explain or discuss in their own lives, like The Mill on the Floss, George Eliot, or Charlotte Bronte was Jane Eyre, wasn't she? And many modern writers write quite properly about the things they want to write about, different countries, or there'll be a lot coming out about COVID or BLM and gender issues and so on. But sometimes it's not quite like that. And I know that some of my family have expressed the worry that they might appear in my pieces. Mm-hmm. And one question came, how much of this latest book comes from your own background? And an old friend said to me, I'm afraid I might appear in your work, when I told her that I'd started writing. So it's a real worry, actually. And I was thinking that on instruction courses and in manuals on writing, write what you know is one of the mantras. But I never heard anyone say, be careful not to write who you know. And I wonder if things are ever discussed in writing courses or books. I know that sometimes I have used a character or a place. It may just be a street. It might be a description of someone's walk or laugh. Sometimes it's not even conscious. I wrote a short story called Colin, where I actually took the physical description of my main character from the electrician who was rewiring my house at the time, and he was just perfect. And I often thought then, supposing he found out later, supposing he found the book or he bought it for his daughter who was interested. And she said, this is just like you, Dad. And then you might have remembered the name of the customer or a date, mm-hmm. and realized what happened. And what would happen? What comeback could he have? What could he do? This is yet another twist on the real and fictional weavage. Mm-hmm. And I heard from you, Felicity, in your talk recently that Jesse Chambers, who was a friend of D.H. Lawrence, strongly objected to his using local people and events in his fiction. He didn't seem to care. And I heard another author say recently, interviewed about his forthcoming memoir, that because his partner was part of his life, he was going to be put into the memoir, even though the partner didn't want to be. As if writers feel they have God-given right of some kind, although most writers I know would never dream of doing that. So I wonder, do ordinary people have any protection from appearing in somebody's fiction? Is there any right not to appear in someone's work? I would feel horribly uncomfortable and angry if I found myself in somebody's work. There are laws of libel and privacy and defamation, but I think they're probably not relevant here. I think it is an ethical issue to do with moral rights. Perhaps the Society of Authors could produce a code, an ethical code. Maybe if you end up like a character in Dickens, that would be wonderful. Maybe there's something you could draw up the guiding line between the rights of the individual and significance of what is written. Mr. Micawber, of course, was based on Dickens' father. Is that okay? I actually found my old copy of David Copperfield, and in the introduction to David Copperfield, it says that this is one of Dickens's most autobiographical works, partly about him, partly about his father. And there's a character apparently in the book, which I haven't read since I was at school. Miss Malcher in the book was a Mrs. Seymour Hill, who, while the novel came out in parts, recognized her portrait, complained to the astounded author, and was made happier by his 32nd chapter. So there you go. So that's another weave in and out, isn't it?
Yes, it
So
is.
the person can complain and have a chapter written
Interesting.
about it and changed. So anyway, I wrote a story called Silk, which is about this. And my character, Jan, is a writer, youngish, just starting out. And rather thoughtlessly, not maliciously or consciously, she does something along these lines. She puts a real person into her novel. And then she has to make a most terrible decision. And I don't know what I would do in this particular situation. So this is just near the end of the novel. Jan has written her novel. It's predicted to be a bestseller. Her publisher's thrilled. Her writing colleagues have all supported her. She's arranged the launches and the libraries and the festivals. It's all wonderful. And then it all comes back to bite her. Something soft and clinging was pulled from her eyes, and she saw clearly and sharply for the first time what she'd done. Oh, what would he think? What would he say? To find himself in her pages, in those scenes that she'd written, between the characters and the cover. How could she have done it? How could it all have happened? She'd been in some kind of dream, her thoughts and wishes all confused. But it was a nightmare now, fiction and truth and imagining torn apart in her mind. She snatched for letters and documents, telephone numbers, papers slipped to the floor. Then she was on her knees, crying and choking, her hair loose and wild about her face. At last she found the contract and took it in her hands, started to tear it up. And then she thought of the publisher and the group who'd helped her, supported her for all these months. Choices. Oh, what had he said? Had he spoken of the choice between ambition and love? Between hope and ambition and shame? When there is no right way, when every choice is a kind of betrayal.
Yes, very powerful. And that story, again, I think, well, difficult to choose a favourite, but it also includes some of the poetry of Gerard Manley Hopkins, which I'm particularly fond of.
Yeah.
I always feel you actually strive for a similar sort of liquidity and kind of elegance. Of
nowhere near. I mean, extraordinary thing was he's important because he had to make a choice. He was a Jesuit priest, and the Jesuits didn't allow anyone to do anything for personal advantage. He wasn't allowed to publish his poems. He sent them to a friend. They were only published after he died, and that must have been the most dreadful torture, I think. He wasn't very successful as a priest, I gather. But he's a priest, but his writing, some of it is so sensuous, sensual even. It's amazing. I wouldn't, but he was so, made so many advances in poetry, the way he used rhythm and assonance, and extraordinary poet. Yeah, I love his poetry.
So the collection also includes stories about the process of writing, particularly his story, and also her story, which I found quite bleak, about a woman who's becomes obsessed with the character she's trying to write. I hope that's not something that you suffer from.
I do, because I hate the word creativity, it sounds so precious. It's quite close to obsession. I mean, maybe some people would disagree, but you do go over and over again trying to get things right, throwing them into the waste paper bin or whatever you use for that. And that's so. There are endless composers, artists. Look at Monet, right? Painting his lilies, and so many obsessives. I think it's part of it. I can quite imagine that the character that the writer in this story was obsessed by, a great character, how to write a great character. How do you do that? She can't do it. She's not good enough to do it. And I think that's not so far away from what quite a lot of writers would feel in one way or another, obsessing to get things right. And I know a lot of writers have taken about 10 years on their first novel, and that must be obsession, mustn't it?
Yes. Which kind of leads me on to the next question of what happens next. As a reader, I often want to know sort of how the story would continue and what the afterlife of the characters would be. Do you find that they haunt you, or that you want to write the next stage?
I think Jan actually haunts me. I did actually start, and at a later stage of Jan's life, she was an old woman and she was moving, she was downsizing, and she came across this cupboard with all, turfing her stuff out, with all her writing, because she completely turned her back on it. She's an accountant now, something very factual, and she comes across all this stuff. She wrote, and all her companions then wrote. And we then go back to that particular section. And it struck me that this could be a sort of French lieutenant's woman with two different endings according to which of the choices she took.
Well, that's your next project then.
Maybe. Yeah.
So I mentioned at the top that we discovered that we were both librarians in our former lives, and you worked for the British Council, which involved travelling to various kind of far-flung places. And I wondered how much of those sort of foreign places and foreign voices have had an impact on what you write. Yes-ish. I had most wonderful opportunities to travel places nobody else, wouldn't normally go, like Ethiopia and Oman, and then Vienna. But they were very foreign indeed, particularly Ethiopia, which was quite dangerous at that time. I didn't travel as much as I'd have liked. And it's quite difficult in an official position to get to know people very well. I guess I could have done more. So I think in both of those countries, you can be the puzzled foreigner, getting stuck because you can't quite make out the local customs. And Oman was absolutely lovely. I did travel there, but most of the people working in Oman, because it was only 7 years old as a country when I was there, were foreign, because Omanis hadn't had any education except for very few who could work abroad. And most of the people who were working were British, I think some American, Indians, Pakistanis, and Egyptians. So again, and I didn't get very fluent in Arabic, really, to my shame. So again, I didn't get to know those countries very well. Vienna was different. That was much closer to what I was used to. But oddly enough, I came across a novel recently about Oman by somebody called Joka Al-Hafi, called Celestial Bodies, and she's an Omani.
and she wrote this novel about some families in Oman and individuals, and it must have been, some of it was the time that I was there, and it was so utterly different to anything I ever perceived or got anywhere close to. But it's left me with a huge interest, obviously, in foreign countries and reading stuff about them and about the people in them, of course. Yes.
One of your stories, Just Words, is very much about those voices.
Yes. Well, this is about how to get beyond the self-absorbed nature of people like me, who are trying to get published, trying to get sold onto the bookshops and so on. And my character, Catherine, is getting no success with publishers for her mysteries and romances. And she wanders miserably around bookshops, looking at all the stuff piled up there before Christmas and feeling bitter and twisted. But a friend takes her along to a refugee writing event that evening, and listening to some of the pieces the refugees have written about their experiences, she learns to her shame that writing is about much more than just getting published, getting into the bookshops, that it can be a matter of imprisonment and exile, even life and death. And this is just a very short piece she hears that night by a young man from the Middle East somewhere. It's called Punishment. It's rather cruel, this piece. I saw everything that they did to my parents, my mother first, while we were all forced to watch, and then my father. Then they were dragged away. I've never found out what became of them. And it was because of me that it happened, because I wrote an article for a magazine in the town. They did not punish me, not at that time, but my mother and father instead. But then my own punishment began. I was punished by loneliness, too, my hunger and fear when I escaped. And now it happens again, not once, but so many times, over and over in my memories and in my dreams. I am safe here at last, but the punishment continues. I do not know if my family and friends are safe as I am. I would endure more punishment if I could know that. I think that the punishment may be forever.
Yes, that's a very powerful piece, and you do give an acknowledgement at the end, don't you, to the Nottinghamshire Refugee Forum?
Yes, I visit
to Freedom from Torture.
Freedom from Torture, which I belonged to a long time, and they do, subject to COVID, I don't know, they do have a regular writing group called Right to Life, and they do regular anthologies and performances, and they do a regular magazine, which I have learnt a lot from in terms of details. So the story tries to show the importance of these groups. It can be therapy for the refugees themselves. If they even can't talk about it, it can help them to come to terms with it. It's information for us so that we know how to improve services for them. I think Five Leaves has an event coming up with LGBT immigrant groups.
Right.
I hope I haven't misrepresented anything in this piece. I haven't wanted to present too rosy a picture. You can't solve everything with a writing group, of course. But further down the road, writers' organisations like the Society of Authors and English Pen do campaign for freedom of speech for writers, and they are successful. And there is a growing number of novels now by emigrant writers, and all about the situations in those countries and what it's like for them in the West and what it was like for them there. And all of that is of real interest to me, definitely, yes.
So as well as writing the the piece like the bit that you just read out from the story Just Words, you also include poetry as part of the sort of refugee voices. How was that, writing poetry?
Well, I've never written poetry in my life, not even you compared me to Gerald Manley Hopkins just over that. It's not quite right, I'm afraid. But they didn't have to be good poems as poems. So I did what is sometimes advised: get up early one morning and just write what comes into your head, sitting in a cafe for a few hours. And that's what I did. And I do think our brains are incredibly complex, clever. If you write in different ways at different times, write with pen and paper, write with a laptop, write with an iPhone, write hanging upside down from the ceiling. It's amazing, I'm quite sure. Even an old-fashioned typewriter, you can write differently, I think. I think we should all try that.
Yeah.
That's how I did it. But they're not good poetry as such. Hopefully they express what we might as well.
Yes. Yeah. So in Just Words and in other stories in this collection and in other of your work, then the layout of the text is often significant, is often important. And that's particularly true with the one in this collection that's called Palimpsest.
Yeah.
Again, very intriguing title, and the idea where the overlapping layout fuels the story. Can you say more about that?
Well, yeah, I was very intrigued by a press report that I heard a year or two ago concerning an extraordinary fragment of parchment that was found, I think, in Egypt, which featured some verses of the Quran in Arabic, I think from the 8th century. And just discernible underneath, possibly because the parchment was beginning to fade or disintegrate, there were some verses of the Old Testament, of the Torah, Deuteronomy, and the Christian Bible in Egyptian Coptic, which apparently shows the cultural interaction between those early communities. And it's the only such document which has ever been found. And that was just mind-blowing, really. So I had to go at some palimpsest myself. And this was the only one that got finished. It's the last in the collection, and I'm sorry, it's a bit downbeat and a bit grim if anyone gets to the end. But it was, apologies for that. It's a bit grim and shocking. But yeah, that was a most intriguing, fascinating, that the only document of that sort ever found. Incredible.
Yeah. But it's an interesting idea, and it's a fascinating idea for a story.
Yeah.
With the sort of well, two stories in a sense, overlapping.
You have to read it. I can't really read that one.
Yes, okay. So I do think that actually one of my favourite in this collection is the title story, The Clock Museum, which I read as being a story about sort of life and death, the passing of one's life, and the kind of perhaps the soul's fight against that, the two sort of different characters. And again, the layout of the text is significant, isn't it, throughout the story, that the chap that goes into the Clock Museum, you don't really know how. Yes.
I don't know if you can see that. There are columns on the right. And columns
you can see a bit, you don't actually really know how old he is, although he does talk about having all the time in the world. And then as he goes through the different floors of the museum, he passes the exuberant decoration on the outside of some of these timepieces, and he sees through the window a young bride reading a letter, and then he moves up to different floors and he sees an old woman pouring coffee from a silver pot. And I wondered whether they were actually the same person that he was seeing, and it was about the sort of, the passing of one's life. And you get to the top floor and it's all the sort of nuts and bolts, the mechanics, you know, which is the sort of the medical indignities that one suffers, you know, with how one's body works as one gets older. But yes, you describe it as a fable.
It's a fable.
What and for you?
Well, I think actually several things during the time I was writing it. It's definitely an alter ego sort of piece. There is a guy who's going up a spiral staircase in a clock museum, and the galleries go out from the spiral staircase. And I think in a sense he is mankind, going up and learning more and becoming more civilized and knowledgeable, and everything gets to the top, and it's really only abstracts. He learns absolutely the basic facts about absolutely everything in the universe. But there's something nasty coming up behind him, and he can't quite make out what it is. I also had the idea, may not be medically very exact, of the brain stem, our own brain stem, basic part of our brains, and the development of the different chambers of our brain as we learn more and as we develop, and they are the parts of the gallery. And I think latterly, given all the wars in the Middle East, and I was thinking of all the beautiful galleries, museums, temples, mosques, churches, statues that were built by all those people originally in the Middle East, the first civilization. And then centuries later, they were destroyed by people in the Middle East. And so there is this sense of development and destruction, and it being the same person, the first person or the third person are interchangeable. So I think you could see several things in it, maybe. So I thought I would just...
you want to finish with a reading?
Yes, I'll just read the beginning of it. But before I do that, I would just like to thank you, Felicity, for your all the wonderful input on this and all your brilliant questions. Very felicitous. And I'd like to thank Five Leaves for running this so smoothly and helpfully. And I'd like to thank all those people who tuned in, and hope we'll be in touch later maybe. So this is the beginning of the Clock Museum. This is partly based on my memories of Vienna, obviously. An old city. Its narrow streets twist like the lines of a snail's shell, outwards from the center, away to the furthest edges. There are fine old buildings, steep, slanting roofscapes and tall spires, ancient stairways where ancient figures might climb forever, always failing to find their destination. The city still holds its memories of East and West, North and South. It was once the center of a great empire, but it is not as it once was. At its outer limits, the splendor has faded and mixes with the dust of the everyday. There are deserted, derelict places now along the streets. And though the tourists and travelers still come to study and enjoy, strange people wander through the stately park sometimes, lingering in corners to surprise the passerby. A small square shaded with trees, enfolded within the oldest part of the city. In it stood the Clock Museum, almost hidden, obscure in its corner, drawing no attention to itself. I lingered at the entrance for a while, for I had time, all the time in the world. When I paid the entrance fee, I thought it high for this small place, which appeared so insignificant, and entered. I walked along the dim corridor towards the galleries, and I was aware that there were no other visitors in the museum, though I had thought that someone entered the doorway behind me. It was very quiet. It seemed that few people found their way here. The grand houses with their splendid sculptures and famous paintings were in other parts of the city. But I felt movement. I felt the air shiver as the seconds fell free and gathered in the rooms, collected as faint cobwebs in the corners. Then the sudden dry flowering, the chiming and beating as each clock spoke and was silent. The museum filled and was empty again. I climbed the spiral staircase and entered the first gallery. I had the impression that someone brushed past me on the steps, but when I looked behind me, no one was there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And can I echo Frances's thanks to all of you for coming. If you have any questions, if you'd like to put them into the Q&A box, then I shall pass them on to Frances and she can answer them.
We'll try.
We've got some lovely comments, certainly, about thank you, that was wonderful.
Thank you, Claire.
Frances, your writings are inspirational.
Oh, and I think, is that the Claire who recommended something about dialect writing, which is something you asked me once about dialect writing. I wasn't able to go, but that sounds like a very interesting thing to go to and something one could learn from. So thank you, Claire. Thank you. Yes.
So we have a question from Diane Peasy. What is Frances working on now?
Well, this has been a long struggle, actually. It's been a long, I'm just going to get my breath back this weekend, but I do have a lot of ideas and something longer, I hope. I've written 4 collections of stories now. I think I really need, but then I don't want to take another 10 years. Supposing I had another 10 years, so I don't know. Lots of ideas.
Short stories have always been your preferred form of writing. You said you never written poetry before, but
yes,
there's something that appeals to you as a medium.
Yes, I feel a lot. Actually, a lot of those short stories could be novels, and I read a lot of novels which I feel could be short stories. I'm a very slow writer, but I've often felt I can do what I need to do in a short story. But I know people don't like reading them so much. People like the entertainment, the journey, the relaxation that a novel brings. And I would like to enter that field. But a short story can actually do so much. It can encompass a life like Mrs. Rosenfarb, or a minute, or an hour, or nothing at all. It can do so much, and I do find it very fascinating indeed. But I know they're not so easy. But I also feel it like a potter making a jug or a bowl. I can do it and feel it and get it finished.
Yeah.
I don't think I could feel that satisfaction if I was a novelist. But maybe I need to try.
So Jenny has asked, which writers of short stories do you admire?
Thank you, Jenny. Chekhov, John McGregor, a lot in between. Italo Svevo for Invisible Cities. The American writer Daniel Mason, who's written a wonderful collection called A Register of My Passage Upon the Earth, which is as wonderful as it sounds. And George Saunders, another American writer. The writer, I think there's a wonderful story by Chekhov, which I'm always going on about. Forgive me if you've heard it before, about a young Russian governess who's very poor. She's in a horrible place. Nobody loves her. She's bullied and looked down on. And she's trundling back through the Russian countryside in the cold and dark to her place of work. And her life is horrible. And they stop at a level crossing for a few minutes. And the train to Moscow flashes by, and it's brilliantly lit. and she sees all the rich people laughing and joking and eating and drinking. It's a brilliant life flashes by her, and then it's gone and she's left in the darkness. And that, to me, is the most brilliant short story ever written, I think. I can't even remember what it's called. I can't find it again, but it's stuck in my mind.
Somebody else will know the answer.
Yeah, but I think John McGregor's short stories are wonderful. Really, really wonderful. There's one called Tulips, I think, where somebody's trying to fit some tulip, and we know they all flop around.
Yes.
And it's a simile for a very difficult situation which is occurring between two people. And he does experiment a lot with form in his short stories. So I do admire his very, very much. And as I said, George Saunders and Daniel Mason. There's probably lots of others.
That's a good list to be going on with.
Yes.
I had a further question, if nobody else had any others, about Nottingham connections. We've obviously touched on the refugee forum, but whether there are any other particular.
Yeah, there's one which is absolutely set in the Castle Museum, which of course we know is opening just about now, isn't it? It's a young boy. He's having a terrible time. He's gay. He's having a very difficult time at home, at school. And he goes up, when life is difficult for him, he goes up to the Castle Museum, wanders around the garden. And he looks out over the city, and at the back he looks out over the railway line and the countryside. And when he goes in, he finds an exhibition about Wedgwood, which I went into myself many years ago. And he finds simile, a likeness with what he finds about Wedgwood, who had the most terrible time as a young boy. His father died. They were in poverty. He was crippled with smallpox. In later life, his leg was amputated, and yet he overcame all this to become the brilliant potter and international businessman. So it's a kind of metaphor for him for overcoming disaster. And that exhibition was in the castle. And anybody who knows the castle will recognize it in that one definition.
We have another question actually from Five Leaves, in fact, saying you read very widely. Mention of Terry Pratchett surprised me, although it probably shouldn't have done.
I haven't read the Terry Pratchett, I just came across it.
Do you make a particular effort to read as widely as you can, and how does that affect your writing?
Gosh, I do think it's important to read widely, definitely. I try to. I'm actually a very slow reader. I read very, very slowly, and maybe it's lockdown, maybe it's age, I don't know what it is. I'm actually reading more non-fiction now. I do read it. Yeah, I guess I read widely, but not thickly, if that makes any sense. Yeah, it's important to read widely. And I'm very lucky. I have cousins in America who send me things that are current there, which I might miss over here. Some of them are about immigrants. There's a wonderful book about an immigrant, Ethiopian immigrant in America, which they sent me. So, yes.
And do you think that the breadth of your reading has an effect on your writing?
Well, hopefully.
That's possible to answer. Maybe that's for somebody else to answer, having read what you've written.
Hopefully, I would say. Yes, hopefully. Yes. I'd have to think about that maybe, but I guess, yeah, I think so. I think so, definitely.
Somebody suggested that the Chekhov story might be called In the Cart.
It might be. Thank you very much. I'll look that up. I know I tried, and I probably remembered it wrongly anyway, but that's what I remember of that story, In the Cart. Thank you very much. In the Cart. He wrote hundreds of short stories.
Well, if Chekhov didn't write that one, then that's yours next, isn't it?
Yeah, thank you. I'll look that one up. In the Cart.
Yes.
That sums up her life. Yeah, thank you, whoever that was.
Anne, it was.
Anne, thank you, Anne. Is that Anne MacDonald? Well, it doesn't matter.
So she would be to tell us. Yeah,
It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Okay. Well, no more questions that I can see so far. Just checking back through the chat box. So I guess we say thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you. And thank you, everyone. Thank you, Five Leaves. And I've really enjoyed it. It was an interesting thing to have to do, actually, to sort of work out what to say and how to say it. And thank you for your questions, Felicity. Excellent.
Well, thank you for asking me to join you. Yes. Thank you and goodbye, I guess is what we say.